So my name is Shaina Sadai. My pronouns are she, her. I am an alumni of UMass several times over. I did my undergrad here, and then I left for a while, and then I came back and did a master's, and then and those were in astronomy, physics, and applied mathematics. And then I did my PhD here in climate science, and I focused specifically on future projections of climate and sea level rise, and conceptualizations of climate justice within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so climate justice at the international level, and then how that feeds down to all of the other levels. I am a member of Scientists for Palestine, which I've been with since 2020, and a member of Jewish Voice for Peace. Rachel and I organized together there for many years, and yeah, I am glad to join you today. I'm gonna send out some sort of resource list after this. Maybe I can give it to you and you pass it along to SJP, because all of the things I'm gonna talk through, I want you to be able to look more into them and have the links to be able to get more information, because this is such a vast topic, and I tried to pull together some notes, but I'm a little bit disorganized because I'm doing too many things. So one of the things that I just wanted to start with is that there are so many people in Palestine that have been working on climate and environmental justice issues forever. Forever. There was never a time that people were not thinking about the environment. They're so connected to that land. And in particular, I wanted to highlight the work of PENGON, which is the Palestinian Environmental NGOs Network. It is led by Amir Boutmeh, who coordinates all of the various environmental NGOs within Palestine, and then puts together these reports on the state of how the Israeli occupation impacts the lived environment in that land. And so they have tons and tons of resources on their website. And Abir has also done a bunch of different teach-ins. I hosted her for a teach-in through Scientists for Palestine, and the recording of that is still on the website. And then the Climate Justice Alliance also hosted her and several other people this past fall for a teach-in. And so, yeah, they have just extensive documentation. And so when the genocide began back in October, I was looking through their website, looking at what they had brought together from past assaults on Gaza and from past traumas in the West Bank, and sort of comparing that to what's happening now. What's happening now is so far beyond anything that has happened in the past that it's so difficult to even start to think about what the ramifications are going to be from this, because in some of the things from the Palestinian Environmental NGOs Network, they've discussed how in previous bombardments, like after the 2014 bombardment of Gaza, part of the issue was that the soil and the water in areas that were hit were so heavily contaminated that, and the buildings that were collapsed, there's asbestos in some of them. There are other sorts of just other toxics that are within the buildings themselves or within manufacturing centers, and all of that gets into the soil and into the water. And so even those previous bombing campaigns, the environmental devastation took so long to clean up afterwards, in part because of the blockade, which has existed for the past 17 years. So it's very difficult to get in construction materials to rebuild. It's very difficult to get in the supplies that are needed to decontaminate the environment. And so after, we don't know what after is going to look like at this point, but it's surely going to be decades of environmental mediation that's going to be needed after this hopefully stops as soon as humanly possible. When we look at what's coming out of Gaza right now, and we see the videos that journalists are posting, that people on the ground are posting, we can already see the environmental devastation. And Bisan Auda and Hindo Kudri have both reported on the Ecocide and the ecological devastation, the piles of rubble and trash and everything that they're having to deal with. And in every video, we can see the clouds of smoke in the background that people are being subjected to breathing in every day, and they cannot wash it off of their skin or their hair. They cannot do anything about what's happening in the air and in the soil and in the water right now. And so there are quotes, I want to quote as much as possible from people who are there. So Abu Diab, who is displaced in Gaza City, says, "This is not life. There is pollution everywhere, in the air, in the water we bathe in the water we drink, in the food we eat, in the area around us." Amir, who is a resident of Rafah, says people have become overwhelmed by the pollution in the air, as well as the use of wood and plastic to build fires, because as they don't have cooking supplies, they're having to burn whatever they have around in order to make cooking fires. And that smoke is also an environmental contaminant that's going to lead to health issues. And they're saying, this is a quote from Amir in Rafah, "The smell is awful and the smoke coming from cars is unbearable. It makes me sick for days. The smell of gunpowder and these awful gases from the ongoing bombardments is doing both the people and the environment real harm." And there are concerns that this is, it's already ecocide. It's already genocide, it's already ecocide. And so under the Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, this is a war crime. Genocide obviously is a war crime. Ecocide is a war crime as well, though very hard to litigate. And obviously the ICJ, I currently work in the field of international law, and so I've barely known how to show up at work, because I'm like, if the opinions coming out of the ICJ aren't going to be listened to by anyone, then how do we enforce that? And so but the ecocide aspect of this and how to actually hold accountability for that is something that I really, really want to see happening. And so I have another quote here from Abir Butma from Pengon, saying, "The Israeli occupation has completely damaged all elements of life and all environmental elements in Gaza. They have completely destroyed the agriculture and the wildlife. What is happening to us, for sure, is ecocide. It is completely damaging the environment in Gaza for the long term, not only for the short term. Palestinian people have a strong relationship to the land. They're very connected to the land and also to the sea." And so there are, it's so overwhelming to think about the extent of what everyone is dealing with right now. And we can also already see the ways that shifts in climate itself are also playing out on top of the genocide that's ongoing. So some of the things about just the climatology of the region, the region itself is obviously experiencing higher and higher temperatures over time, and that particular region in the Eastern Mediterranean is warming at twice the rate of the global average, which means that they are experiencing, of course, more frequent and more severe heat waves. But every increment of warming that occurs comes with it more and more severe heat waves. And so I'll get back to the heat in a little bit, but I want to pause to go into a little bit the extreme precipitation. So as the atmosphere warms, a warming atmosphere can hold more moisture in it, which means you get heavier and heavier precipitation events. And we saw this play out in January when there were several days of really extreme rainfall that occurred. And Hind and other journalists were reporting from the ground that people in the tents were experiencing flooding. And obviously they cannot dry off. People were trying to scoop water out of the tents. And so it's the climate injustice of that, there's no way to even put it into words. It's so beyond what is ever acceptable to happen on this planet. So the region is experiencing less rainfall in total annually, which makes it more susceptible to drought, but simultaneous to the lower overall rainfall is those punctuated events of really high precipitation. So long-term, less overall rainfall, but more high precipitation, extreme rainfall events like the one that we saw in January. And that is expected to worsen over time under climate change as it goes forward. And so we'll get back to like the occupation and the impact of the occupation on the ability of people to deal with this. But that week in January, there was just the rain, it was exacerbating the issues that were already happening under the collapse of the healthcare system. And so like once you have that rain and that flooding and it's washing like sewage and other things into contaminating the drinking water more and more, and the drinking water is already non-existent. It's absolutely non-existent. And so that heavy rainfall, which is washing everything around, that is something that there's just no way for people in that situation to deal with. In the West Bank, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so Palestinian society is obviously heavily fractured by the Israeli occupation. There is Gaza, there is the West Bank, there are the Palestinian people who are displaced within the lands occupied in 1948, so the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then there's Palestinians living in the diaspora. So, like I was saying, Palestinians are very, like, the occupation keeps Palestinian people fractured from each other. So there are the people who live in Gaza, there are the people who live in the West Bank. What is this? There's just a random medal on the ground.
It's from the encampment.
Oh. R.I.P. It was beautiful while it lasted. There are the Palestinians that are in the West Bank, and they are fractured themselves into different areas, which are then like heavily separated and militarized. There are the Palestinian people who are displaced or who live within the 48, within the lands occupied in 1948, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they are dealing with the racism of Israeli society. And then there are the Palestinians living in the diaspora. And so in the West Bank, there's a large extent to which like Israeli society does this weird sort of like military occupation version of NIMBYism, where they put a lot of the like industrial facilities and heavily polluting projects into the West Bank so that pollution happens in Palestinian areas rather than in predominantly Israeli areas. And I know you've seen this firsthand.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, sometimes it's like, so the wall, which separates the West Bank from Israel, which was supposed to follow the borders of the 1967. But whenever there's like a natural resource, like let's say like, oh, there's an aquifer, the wall will cut into Palestine to make sure that it's on the Israeli side. And in addition to that, yeah, there's just this like line of like industrial buildings, and sometimes literally there will be a pipe leading toxic waste from the building that's on the Israeli side through the wall to just dump it out into like the grass.
Yeah.
So there's like this, you know, you will just come upon like on the border on the Palestinian side, like pools of toxic waste.
Yep.
That are just fed out through a pipe from factories on the Israeli side. It's like environmental racism.
Yeah.
Architecture.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's all financially incentivized. So like those industries, they get tax breaks and financial incentives to go to those locations. So it's specifically more profitable for those industries to participate in this type of environmental racism and environmental apartheid. It's incredibly disgusting. And so this also obviously engineers the demographics, and there's more on this that's also was in the Climate Justice Alliance teach-in that they did in the fall, and I'll send you all the like recording of that. And one thing that this also does that is an environmental injustice is that it severely impacts not just the Palestinian people, but the biodiversity of Palestine. And so when I attended the third international meeting for science in Palestine back in 2020, one of the speakers was Mazin Kumisea, who is the director of the Palestinian Museum of Natural History and the Palestinian Biodiversity Institute, and he's also a professor at Bethlehem University. And the talk that he gave at that point was on some of the research that they've done about how Israel's environmental devastation of Palestinian lands feeds back on biodiversity and causes a biodiversity crisis in occupied Palestine. And he was specifically speaking about one of the papers that he'd written with one of his students about the butterflies of Palestine. And I had literally never heard anyone talk about the butterflies of Palestine before. Like, I had never heard someone talk about that. But obviously, all of this environmental devastation impacts all living things, even down to the tiniest of insects. Which also reminds me, this is the ecological version of the keffiyeh from Herbawi, which is the colors on it are chosen for the Suleiman beetle, which is one of the little scarab beetles that has like really vibrant black and red spots on it. And so another aspect of the environmental devastation is the deforestation. And so between the year 2000 and the year 2020, 500,000 olive trees were uprooted. And the olive harvest is, of course, a very important cultural practice. And it's a time when families come together. There's lots of songs. There's lots of joy in the olive harvest. But the occupation, of course, tries to take away that joy anytime that they can. And so here is a quote from Ahmed Kudea, who is an olive farmer, who says, "Over the past years, the land that I cultivate has been subjected to various types of violations from Israeli soldiers. I have been exposed several times to gunfire. The army has also bulldozed the land and sprayed the crops with pesticides to destroy them. This has caused me huge financial losses, but each round of destruction, I return to prepare the land for cultivation again." Another quote from Nisreen Abudaka says, "Our hearts burn over our lands. We wait all year long for the olive season, which is the most beautiful season, but the Israelis have deliberately burned our trees using their missiles and tank shells." That quote is from someone who is an olive farmer in Gaza. There was also, the olive harvest gets more and more dangerous every year as the settlers become more and more emboldened because they are never held accountable for their actions. And this past year, on October 30th, Bilal Mohammed Saleh, who is an olive farmer in Al Sawiya, he was murdered by an Israeli settler as the Israeli military watched. They just watched, as they do. And there is the settlers and the military, these are like, they're not separable. And as a lot of the solidarity activists and the Palestinians who are living in these occupied lands have been reporting more and more lately that the settlers are enlisting in the army, and then they come back to the lands that they terrorized as settlers in an army uniform, and they continue that terrorism. And so the settlers and the army and the Israeli police, these are not like separatable things. They're all parts of the same system, and they all work very much together. So when you see these crimes occurring, it's often that the settlers are there with the protection of the military. In Gaza, the current bombardment has destroyed almost half of the agricultural land, so 11,000 square kilometers. And there are several groups that have been trying to calculate the extent to which the environment and the agricultural lands have been damaged. And the UN Satellite Center and also Bellingcat, which is an investigative journalism outlet, they have both released studies from satellite imagery trying to show the extent of the devastation. And the Israeli military will claim, like, this is for our strategic whatever the fuck. But obviously, that is not true. Like, there's no military reason for destroying agricultural land other than to perpetuate the genocide through starvation that occurs because of their blockade policies.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So another thing that's happened in Gaza since the beginning of this current genocide is that the military has built a new road that literally bisects Gaza in half. It runs from east to west. And in order to build roads like this, what they do is they dig up. They dig up land, and it doesn't matter what's in the way. It doesn't matter if it's a water source. It doesn't matter if it's agricultural land. It doesn't matter what was there. But for quote, security purposes, not only do they dig up what they need for the road, they dig up everything that's for yards and yards to either side, so that like, you know, to protect the people who are building the road. And then the road, after, you know, leaving in this like wake of environmental devastation, will be Israeli only. So if you're Palestinian and you're on the road, you will just be shot on sight.
Yep.
And so there's a new road. It literally runs from one side of Gaza on the east, to the other side of Gaza to the sea. And it's really similar to what happened with the building of the wall. Similarly, it's not like they just like dug up what they needed for the wall. They seized all this land on both sides and just destroyed everything to put up this like huge concrete apartheid wall that in some places is 3 times higher than the Berlin Wall. And similarly with the Israeli roads, they will purposefully cut a town away. They will separate a town from where the ancestral olive lands are. And again, if you're Palestinian and you're seen on the road, you will just be shot on sight. When I was there in 2002, part of what international volunteers were doing were just walking in a circle around like 1 or 2 farmers to cross the road so that they could just even check on their olive groves, which had been in their family for like generation upon generation upon generation. I mean, it's like the environmental, there's no way to separate the environmental piece of it from the colonial land grab, from the apartheid, from the genocide, from the racism. Like it's like they are all so deeply interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely. Another group that's been using satellite imagery to try to get a handle on how vast the devastation is of the agricultural center is Forensic Architecture. That's the name of the group. And Samana Moafi, who is their assistant director of research, describes the satellite imagery and the devastation they've seen as being absolutely systematic. So she says, after the initial damage from aerial bombardment, ground troops arrived and dismantled greenhouses completely, while tractors, tanks, and vehicles uprooted orchards and fields and crops. What is left is devastation. The area is no longer livable. There's no reason for it other than to perpetuate the genocide through starvation by destroying the agricultural land and anything that they could have grown there. One family who has been displaced to the south said that their farm and their orchards were destroyed completely, replaced by military earthworks for the new road to carve through it that Rachel was just talking about. The family says, quote, "There is almost nothing left to recognize here. There's no traces of the land we knew. They totally erased it. It is now just a desert. There is not a single tree there, no traces of our prior life. If I was to go there, I would not be able to recognize it." Like, the toll, the like physical and mental toll of dealing with the erasure of their cultural heritage and their family heritage, that it's just like, it's beyond what I can really comprehend. And so, according to the United Nations Environment Program, this heavy bombardment of populated areas will contaminate the soil and groundwater in the long term, both through the munitions themselves and through the collapsed buildings, as they release hazardous materials such as asbestos, industrial chemicals, and fuel into the surrounding air, soil, and groundwater. So exactly the same things that the Palestinian Environmental NGOs Network have documented from previous bombardments. And these attacks on the land, the people, the trees, they are exactly interconnected injustices, as Rachel was just saying. So there's the climate injustice of the loss of soil carbon sequestration, the emissions that are happening because of the bombardment, which I can get into, the environmental injustice of the soil erosion, the environmental degradation, the loss of trees and other plant and biodiversity. It's also a multi-species injustice. Obviously, the trees themselves deserve to grow there and deserve to be cultivated by the people who love them. There's the loss of habitat for animals like the Palestinian sunbird, and the emotional trauma of people who love their land, their trees, and their cultural heritage. So getting back to the heat for a second. So that region, like I said, is warming twice as fast as the global mean, which makes heat waves more extreme and more severe. Before October 7th, Gaza had about 4 hours a day of electricity, which always caused a lot of trouble during heat waves, because obviously people who are experiencing a heat wave need to be able to have access to fans or air conditioning or shade and certainly clean water. What'd you say?
Refrigerator.
A refrigerator to keep food cold, to get ice, to chill, like anything. But even before October 7th, Gaza was dealing with about 4 hours a day of electricity. And people were trying to figure out ways of handling that. And I have an example of that, but I think it's on a different page. This is an obscene amount of notes that I brought with me. It's never any less notes than this when I teach. It's always this level of chaos. Yeah, please.
So, just in case, like, you ever hear people talk about, oh, but like Israel has like planted all these trees, and Israel has like reforested all this land that like Palestinians mismanaged, into desert. That's completely false propaganda, lies. In fact, some of the forests that the Israelis have built, in addition to not being indigenous tree species, and so they're like actually not good for the soil.
No.
There's instances that have been documented where, so during the Nakba in 1948, when over 750,000 Palestinians were either massacred or forcibly expelled from their land, and when over 400 Palestinian villages were just razed to the ground, the Jewish National Fund, other organizations, they would plant a forest on top of a site of a destroyed village so that no one could ever find it.
Yeah.
It's like they used like this like fake program of forestation to hide genocide. And so and even like, so there's this book written by a woman who came and spoke here on campus in October, where she's Israeli, she's in her 80s now. Her retirement project has been just trying to document whatever she can of where to even find these remains of these 400 villages. And some of them are these forests that she remembers going to picnics to as a kid. She said, yeah, I remember the trees were like really small and scraggly because they were all planted at once. And it's like if you go digging, if you go like looking around, you'll be like, weird, what's that strange cement structure? And then she brought in like Palestinian folks to be like, oh, that was part of a concrete foundation of a building. And then from there, like retracing the village that was there and sort of like overlapping it with like maps that Palestinians had tried to make. But it's like, again, like this, like the greenwashing of like, Israel has planted X amount of trees. It's like in order to like cover up their crimes of genocide.
Yes. Yeah, there's been some sessions at this conference I attend annually called the American Association of Geographers, where several people work on Palestine, like doing research there, and are Palestinian themselves, and advocate as one of their like research tools decolonial cartography. So like going in and finding old maps and like the stories that maps tell, and then like comparing an old map to what is actually there now, and being able to sort of like reconstruct like what is the narrative of this land, what happened on this land, and how can really old maps help tell us about what existed there before. But the example that I was trying to look through before about how people in Gaza tried to deal with the fact that they only had 4 hours a day of electricity. So there is a Majad Mashauri. She is an entrepreneur who created a company called Sunbox, which was something that, so she grew up in Gaza, and she was dealing with the electrical blackouts. And when she was attending university and was majoring in civil engineering, she was like, I need to be able to use my degree to like help my people. And so she started this company called Sunbox, which works on trying to get the elements to put together like individual household level solar installations at no cost for people in Palestine to be able to generate their own electricity, because the Israeli occupation controls their electricity. So there are people that were trying to like work on this. And that was one example. And there is, on the Scientists for Palestine website, you can hear her talk about Sunbox and about like what that was like. And so getting back to the heat, and obviously if you have no electricity, you cannot really deal with a heat wave. And so we saw the first horrifying inklings of what this summer is going to be like when a heat wave hit Gaza a week ago. And it was horrific. At least 2 children died from the heat just last week because there's nothing to protect them. And it's horrifying. The UN and UNRWA put out statements about how the high temperatures are already contributing to the spread of disease, and it's worsening the smells in the region. It can spoil the limited food reserves that people have. And the 1.2 million people who are displaced living in tents, those tents are trapping the heat. And so several journalists, Ibrahim Atif posted on his Instagram on April 27th, tents are a weapon. They are a safe haven for displaced people, but they have become a place that suffocates them and poses a threat to their lives. The people thought that if they lived in tents that they would be safe, but the living conditions in these tents are harsh and deadly. The children of Gaza City are living in these tents are experiencing huge problems due to the high temperatures and the weather. The temperature of the tents affects them, in addition to the emergence of insects, worms, and snakes from the land surrounding their tents. And so there's no electricity to run fans. There's no water to drink. There's barely any functioning shelter. There's no hospitals if people need to be treated for heat stroke. And when people are malnourished from the lack of food, they're even more susceptible to harsh environmental conditions, and they're even more susceptible to heat waves. So it's the feeding back of all of the different elements of the genocide that are exacerbating all of this. And we started late, but I don't think we have a specific time. And so another thing is, I'm gonna probably skip ahead on some of these because I just have so much information. I think I'm not even a little bit of the way through this. But so the access to clean water issue is another part of the environmental damage. So obviously they have no access to water at all. And Gaza needs desalination plants to run because it's on the Mediterranean Sea, and the Mediterranean is extremely salty. And the Mediterranean is also experiencing sea level rise. And it's primarily the sea level rise there is thermospheric sea level rise, which means it's because the water is accumulating more heat itself and then the water is expanding. And so that level of sea level rise that's being experienced on the Gaza shore is more than the global average. It's sea levels are rising there faster than in other places, which means that the salt in the water is contaminating their groundwater resources. And this is something that they deal with all the time, which is why they need to constantly run desalinization plants to be able to make the water drinkable. But of course, those are all destroyed now. And so they are experiencing a climate injustice of sea level rise as they are experiencing all of the other aspects of this genocide. The sea level rise is part of this problem. And as a sea level researcher, I've been I can't get it out of my head that what they're experiencing in part is because of rising sea levels. That is part of why they don't have water. But of course, the main reason they don't have water is because they're under a military occupation and they are experiencing genocide. And so the UN Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights has said that every hour that passes with Israel preventing the provisioning of safe drinking water in Gaza Strip is in brazen breach of international law, puts Gazans at risk of dying of thirst and diseases relating to the lack of safe drinking water, according to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to save the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation. The expert warned that children will be the first ones affected by the water and sanitation crisis, particularly those under 5 years old. Quote, Israel must stop using water as a weapon of war. Under Article 7 of the Rome Statute, intentionally depriving a civilian population of conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction is an act of extermination and is classified as a crime against humanity. There's also, so another aspect of the water injustice is the flooding of the tunnels. And we heard about this, remember, like months ago, we heard that the Israeli military was starting to flood the tunnels with seawater back in December. We haven't heard anything about this since, because how can people track it? All universities are destroyed. Can a Palestinian scientist go take water samples and have them analyzed somewhere right now? No, they can't. And so there's no way to really report on what has occurred from this. But we know that impact is happening. We know that they did pump that water into the tunnels, that is contaminating the groundwater even worse. And we won't really know the extent to that until environmental analysts are able to check that. Mark Zaytoun, who is a professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute and has written extensively on climate change in Palestine. He has papers going back like 2 decades. His papers are really good. But he used to work as a water engineer in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank. And he says that Israel is clearly weaponizing the water. And when he first saw the pumping of seawater into the tunnels, he said, quote, "My first reaction was profound distress. Injecting salt water will definitely contaminate the aquifer, and this will have long-term consequences. It will ruin the conditions of life in Gaza. If we don't react to this kind of behavior, what's to stop any other country from also doing this to a group of people in the future? What we see happening in Gaza is beyond the pale. With the definition of the Genocide Convention in mind, salinating the aquifer, which is one of the main sources of water, will bring about their destruction. Part of it could collapse and it could become unusable." There's also, we're running like late, so I'm gonna go through a bunch of the rest of this like in very broad terms, and then I'll give you all the links so that you can read more about anything you want. But as the genocide is taking place in Gaza, settler attacks have massively ramped up in the West Bank. And part of that is that they specifically go after water. They specifically go after wells and cisterns. And there's a group called Kivsa Shora who they do the like protective presence. They are Israelis who work with Palestinians to document the crimes of apartheid. So they're anti-Zionist Israelis, which is a thing that does exist. And so they have documented many instances. On April 30th, they put on their Instagram, settlers used a knife to cut a pipe that connects some houses to water, cutting off those houses and families from their connection to running water. The policeman arrived and was like, well, the settlers have the right to be here, and told the owner of the water, go file a complaint, which of course it's an apartheid legal system. They can't file a complaint and have anything actually be done about it. So from April 17th, everyone was busy with the Iranian drones, and 3 settlers snuck into the village of Wadi Jiesh and cut the electric cables, pointed guns through the windows of the houses, entered the houses and stole objects. When they left, they opened the water tank and let it all spill onto the ground. The residents heard their monthly water supply was emptying, but they remained locked in their houses and did not dare go out to try to close the tank. If one of them had gone out to try to protect the water while the settlers were still there, there's a very high chance that we would have heard the next morning, quote, "I guess it was a terrorist that posed attack to the settlers and had to be neutralized," saying that it's unsafe for them to go out and try to protect that water. And so, yeah, there are many other instances of this on their Instagram. There was another one from February 1st where settlers poured diesel and oil into the water wells of the people of Masafaryata, where citizens depend on that water. It's their only source of water. And I'm just going to go over the greenhouse gas stuff really quick. So obviously previous emissions have led to the climate injustices that are being experienced today, and the emissions that are coming from the current bombardment will cause climate injustice in the future. But of course, the greenhouse gas emissions are not our primary concern here. Our primary concern is the genocide and the people themselves. But the greenhouse gas emissions should not be ignored either. So the U.S. Department of Defense is the largest institutional user of petroleum and the largest source of emissions, according to Netta Crawford, who is a researcher on this at Brown University. She says that about 20% of the U.S.'s annual operations of emissions go towards fossil fuel interests in the Gulf region. And of course, the answer to military emissions, to reducing military emissions, is not green militarism, it's demilitarization. There's currently no reporting requirements for any military emissions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is something that activists are always trying to get on the table, but obviously countries like the US block that every single time. And so some researchers put out that study that I'm sure you've seen on social media or in the news about trying to calculate the emissions from the first 60 days of this. And so that paper was under the context of trying to say why it's so important that military emissions be calculated and reported to the UNFCCC. And so in that research, they were looking at where those emissions came from, and the vast majority were from air flights, from the bombing raids that Israel is conducting every single day, and from the U.S. resupply missions. So it's about 50-50 from the U.S. resupply missions and from the Israeli warplanes. And that is the main source of the emissions. But that paper also calculated emissions from aircraft, from tanks, from other vehicle fuels. They anticipated the cost of reconstruction because cement is actually associated with really high greenhouse gas emissions. And then Oil Change International, which is a nonprofit group that tracks fossil fuel use globally, they put out a very short study tracking the supply chains of the crude oil and the refined products that are keeping the Israeli genocide fueled right now. And so the U.S. is the main direct source of imported jet fuel. If the U.S. was not supplying jet fuel, those planes could not stay in the air. So it is obviously, this is specifically like the U.S. is keeping this all going. But the oil majors, so BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, Eni, and Total Energies, they are all the ones that are supplying the oil. There's also oil coming in via Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Brazil and Saudi Arabia are also supplying Israel with fuel. Israel has received three tankers of JP-8 jet fuel from the United States since the genocide started. And yeah, their research, I'll give you the link to that so you can go through it, but that is showing like literally where is the oil coming from. And I want to point out that the BDS committee, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Committee, has called for consumer boycotts of Chevron, Texaco, and Caltex gas stations all around the world, because Chevron is supplying the oil that is keeping this running, and Chevron is enriching themselves, obviously, through the sale of those products, but also through trying to exploit the gas fields off the coast of Gaza. And I can send you a link to learn more about that as well. And I guess this will be some of my last points. There's a paper called No Justice, No Adaptation about climate adaptation in the region, and that talks about how climate adaptation planning, like if you just discuss climate adaptation in the context of like the physical changes that are occurring, more frequent heat waves or more extreme precipitation, you miss that the actual like thing that's impacting people's ability to adapt to climate change is not just the physical climate changes, it is the occupation, it is the geopolitical situation, the system of apartheid. That is what is the source of the vulnerability to climate change. People cannot put their own climate adaptations in place, cannot enhance their climate resilience unless they're not under military occupation. And so that paper just goes through that really in detail, and puts it in the context of also how like climate adaptation measures, they're often funded by, like NGOs or other outside groups, and those groups don't want to touch the political situation. And so that really limits what adaptation measures can even get international funding, because you have to have someone who's going to allow you to talk about the reality of the situation, or you're not going to be able to really address it. So yeah, we're going to switch to the next topic, but I just want to conclude by saying that there can never ever be climate justice under military occupation, under apartheid, under genocide. It just cannot happen. And so the occupation has got to end. People need to have self-determination. People need to have free and equal rights. And that is, that's the situation of climate and environmental injustice in Palestine. That's very abbreviated, but I will give you a lot of resources, and you can all learn more about this afterwards.
And the inverse or the converse, or of that you can't have economic or environmental justice under apartheid and war and genocide, is that if you care about the climate, you have to care about Palestine.
Yeah.
You cannot silo out, be like, I'm an environmentalist, but that affects everybody. And, Palestine is happening all the way over there.
There's no separation. If you care about the climate, if you call yourself an environmentalist, you have to care about Palestine, and you have to demand for an end of the genocide and an end of the occupation.
Yep. Yep.
Thank you so much, Shaina. That was amazing.
Oh, good.